Frank Hyder is a well-known, renowned visual artist. When he started to become an artist, he thought the journey would be a straightforward progression. Over the years, he has discovered that the road has many twists and turns, numerous hills and valleys, and countless challenges. Through this series of short stories, tales, and remembrances, his hope is that these will offer some valuable insight into the life of an artist and what's involved in becoming an artist. In the end, he has come to realize that he is not a painter or sculptor or anything in particular. He is more simply a creative person with great passion and love for the process of making art concerning people and the world around us, who shares his artworks with the public. Join us now as we listen to another episode of A Life in Art series.
When one's becoming an artist, one needs role models and one needs examples. Otherwise, how would you know what it means to be an artist? Of course, you know that means you're going to make paintings or sculptures or something. But there's more to it than that. There's a way of life, and there's in my mind, becoming an artist is somewhat similar to taking an oath or something. I remember when I went to art school, I bought a wedding ring because I wanted to have that sense of commitment to what I was doing, and to me it made some real sense. Anyway, in my second year of graduate studies, I was in my studio and a new critic for the semester came in, and he was a burly guy, kind of chunky, stocky, boisterous, and he came into my studio with his arms laden with big books and introduced himself to me as Paul Georges. Well, I really didn't know who Paul Georges was, but some of the other students did seem to know who he was. And he came into the room and he sat down, he looked around the room, looked at my paintings, and started talking to me about Renaissance composition. And he would open these books and he would point on each of the pages, these images, paintings by Veronese or Rubens or Piero della Francesca. And he's indicating different things and talking to me about how these paintings were constructed. And I'm just listening. I really don't have a context for this guy. He's somebody who I really don't quite know who he is and what to make of him. And then he asked me, he's looking at a big painting I'm working on, and he asked me, he says, do you have a piece of charcoal? And I said, yeah, right here. And I handed him a stick of charcoal. And he walks over to my canvas and he says, now, you see how you have this here? If you had moved it over here just a little bit, and then he takes the charcoal and he begins to draw on the canvas. And then he says, and if this was over here, was just a little bit to this side, you'd have this relationship like the one I showed you in the book. And he starts moving. Well, anyway, he's scribbling with this charcoal all over my wet painting, and he's got all of these lines and moving it all around. And when he was all done, he sits back and he shows me how the lines that he had created on my painting were in relation to the ideas he was trying to show me in these master paintings. And then he sort of basically got up and walked out of the room. And I sat there staring at this canvas, wondering what the heck had just happened. And I really didn't quite understand that. All I knew is that whatever had been on that canvas was now gone. And I had this mess of a kind of drawing scheme made with charcoal into wet oil paint. I knew I would get over that, and I chalked it off as probably an important lesson. But I will say that I made certain that there was never any charcoal in any place where he could see it whenever he would come back to visit me again. And he did come and visit me with regularity. He would stop in, and he was really a great kind of conversationalist, and a guy who always had something he wanted to tell you, and he always had something interesting to show you. And he knew more about old master paintings than anybody I'd ever seen. And he kept talking and and talking about all the possibilities of paint. And he was terribly interested in me because he said, you really paint a lot. And he was interested in how I took care of my materials and all the rest. And then he says to me, if you get up to New York, why don't you come to my studio for a visit? And I said, well, I think I'll do that. I'll be glad to do that. So in about a week or two, I happened to go up to New York, and I had his address on a piece of paper in my pocket, and I found it, and I still remember it was 75 Walker Street. So I walked down to where 75 Walker is, and it's a street full of, sort of New York style, industrial-ish 19th century buildings. And I walked up the steps, and I look at the doorbells, and on the doorbells, there's Red Grooms, there's Philip Pearlstein, there's Jack Beale, and then there's Paul George's with 2 doorbells. And I said, oh my goodness. So I had to walk up the 3 flights of stairs to get to his first floor. And there was a big, what's called a police door, which is one of these metal doors that slides from left to right. It doesn't swing open. It just moves like a barn door does. And I knock on the door, and with that, this black door opens, and there is Paul standing inside his room in front of a big black table, and he welcomes me to step in, and I step in, and there's this table. Over top the table, there's a shelf, and there's a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and it's playing classical music. It looked like a big reel. It could go on forever, hours and hours. And I turned my eye to the left, and I saw this huge painting space, and he had taken 2 floors and cut the joist out so that he had this towering 30-foot space, and he had pulleys set up on the ceiling way up, and he could raise and lower these huge canvases, and he was working on these big paintings with these figures on beaches, and there were drawings laying all over the floor and paintings leaning against all the walls, and the smell of paint, the look of paint. There was all this work all around. And then I looked to the right, and there was this woman sitting at the end of this table, this little frail-looking woman who was his wife, Yvette. She was sitting there, and she spoke with a French accent because she was French. And beyond them, there was a little area in the back where he and his wife had their bedroom, and his daughters had their bedroom on the next level above it. And I thought, now this is a studio home. This is like, this guy has put art into his life in such a way that there's no escaping. There's nothing here but painting and living. That's all there is. And it was a powerful impact that it just meant so much to me to see that you could live this way. And I absolutely was insanely interested in his paintings and this whole thing he was doing there. And so as the weeks would go on, he would come into my studio and always had something to say to me. He was always happy to see me, and we'd start to go to lunch together. And so I really had a development with him that was really special, and I felt really close. And so anyway, after I got to graduation, and after I had graduated, I got a phone call from him, and I was living back in New Jersey in my parents' building, and the phone rings, and it was Paul, and he says, look, you belong in New York, and I have a job for you. I found a job and a place to stay, and he said, so what I want you to do is come to this address, and this guy, Greg, will meet you, and he'll explain the job, and you will take over this job because he's going to go to the Hamptons for 6 to 8 weeks, and when he comes back, then you can decide what you want to do. But he said, you have to come to New York to see whether you belong in New York. So anyway, I followed his directions. I went up to New York on the bus. I got off at the Port Authority. I walked across to 42nd and 2nd Avenue, and I walked up the steps of this strange little church building. When I say little, it seemed little because on either side of it there were 40-story buildings, but it was a pretty good-sized building. If it had been anywhere else, it would have been big, but here it looked small because it was dwarfed by these giant buildings on either side. Anyway, I rang the doorbell, and Jeff came to the door. Greg, rather, came to the door, and he put out his hand, and he said, Paul sent you? And I said, yes. So he said, okay, here's the place. Here are the keys. And he showed me around. He says, this is where the mop is. This is where this is. This is what you do over here. Here's the schedule, right? Monday you have to do this. Tuesday you have to do this. Wednesday, etc. Gave me the list. He said, all right, now you got the idea. I'll show you where the apartment is. We went upstairs. He opened the door. There was a room that he was using as his apartment, and there was an area where he painted. And he said, so this is where you can live. And then he said, all right, we're done here, so let's go to Times Square. And we went to Times Square, and we went to bars and went from one place to the other, and he showed me around Times Square. And believe me, I had never seen anything quite like Times Square at that time. It was a pretty raunchy and bawdy place. Anyway, we went back to the church after that, and we just kind of collapsed. I collapsed on a sofa, and in the morning I woke up, and Greg got up, and he told me he was leaving for the Hamptons. He went out the front door, and he never came back. And I do see Greg now. He's a very successful New York painter. He's doing very well, and he lives out in the Hamptons, and I do see him. But at the time, he left. And I did have one more visit with him after a few weeks, but basically I was in this building, and I had to figure out what my job was and how to do it. And then my wife came up, and we were just living there, and I started to figure out how to be a painter. After a certain point, Paul George's invited me to join him, and once a week he would go around to young artist studios he would always have an entourage of people with him. And there were 5 or 6 or 7 young artists, and we would go visit an artist, and we'd go in their studio, and the artist would show us their work and talk about it, and we'd ask them questions. And it was really a great and generous thing he was doing. He was introducing each other to other artists and showing them around the city. And then once a month, or there was a Thursday night, there would be openings in the galleries in Soho, and Paul would always be there, and he would go from gallery to gallery, and there would be a group of people who would sort of follow him and listen to what he was saying, how he would talk about the work that was on the walls. He was really a character, but he was really well known in New York. He had shown in the Whitney Biennial several times. He was a very controversial, stubborn, independent painter, but he was a unique art force. And his wife Yvette, he had met her in the studio in Paris. He had met her at a party in Brancusi's studio, and Paul had been a World War II veteran, and the war was over. He met her. He was studying art in Paris. So he came back to New York, and he was living in New York and painting, and he got to develop quite a reputation. He was on the cover of Art News in 1959 with one of his paintings. He was in the Whitney Biennial. He was doing well. And then he bought a summer farm in the Hamptons, and his next door neighbor was Jackson Pollock. And Paul was a guy who, generous of heart, strong of opinion, and a very rarely a rich character, a guy that when he was in the room, you knew you were with somebody. He would reach out and visit me in my studio, and he brought a whole group of young artists up to my studio, and he was convinced that what I was doing was really exciting and I should be talking to dealers, and he was always reaching out and very generous. Well, anyway, I was having a show in a gallery on Spring Street at one point, and Paul was having a show in a gallery across the street, and I I went across the street and he was being interviewed by Art News, and he's in the room and he's telling the people in Art News, you should go across the street and see this guy's show. It's great. He's terrific. Now, that was the kind of guy he was. He was really, in the main, a very important artist, but he was always thinking of how to get other artists an opportunity to get into the game. Over the years, my relationship with Paul was intermittent. I'd see him from periodically, but I never forgot those early connections. The last time I personally dealt with him, I had been in New York. I had since been living in Philadelphia, and I would come to New York to see art shows, etc. And there was a big Matisse show at the Museum of Modern Art, and I had come up twice before and tried to see it, and each time I could never get tickets. So anyway, I had gone by early in the day, and there was a big long line. I said, well, I'll stop by later in the day. Maybe I'll get luckier. So I came at the museum from the different direction, so I actually was much closer to the front door. And as I'm right there about to walk past the door and I see this long line going down the street, I hear this voice call out my name, and I turn, and there's Paul standing in line. And he calls me over, and he's standing there with another artist, and he introduces me, and we start talking, and we're just standing there, and the line is slowly moving. And at a certain point, I said, well, look, Paul, you're gonna go in, and I'm not gonna be able to get in, because he said, why can't you go in? I said, well, because I'm butting in line here. And he said, well, why are you worried about that? He said, how do you think I got in line? I just butted in. You're going to go in with me. So we went up to the counter, and at that time, they said you had to pay something. It was pay what you could. So Paul puts 25 cents on the counter and says to the guy, this is what I'm paying. And the guy looks at him, and Paul said, it says something. That's something. So I was feeling a little sheepish, and I gave him $1, and the other artist gave him a couple of dollars, and we go into the show, and we're walking around looking at the painting, and we're in this room with this really big painting by Matisse called The Dance, and as we step into the room, suddenly Paul steps to the center of the room, and in a big booming voice he said, this is why this artist is greater than all the rest of us. And he began to postulate and talk about how this painting was so important and how great it was. Everyone in the room was riveted to every word he said. Everybody staring at him because no one had ever seen anybody do this before. So anyway, we went through the whole show. I bid him farewell at the end, and little did I know it would be the last time I would see him. The next encounter I had with Paul was a little bit with his ghost, in the sense that I had heard that he had died, and he had been in France when he died, in Normandy. He had sold his farm that was next to Jackson Pollock's farm in the Hamptons and got quite a bit of money for it. And he went to Normandy in France and bought a big farmhouse with a couple of big buildings. They were holding an event at the studio school in New York, a memorial for Paul. So they put up a show of his paintings, and there was probably 100 artists who had gathered. And it was really a memorable day. My old friend Greg was there, and whose apartment I got when I first went to New York, and many other artists. And what was most interesting, there wasn't a single camera in the room, just artists. We just were talking and sharing stories. And then there was the memorials, and people gave some speeches, and Jim Wilson, who is now in St. Louis, gave a talk about how Paul's paintings were the most outrageous paintings made in New York in the 1970s. And I certainly agreed with him. They were kind of outrageous. And Paul had taken on political topics. He had been sued for painting an artist as a rapist in a painting, and the artist sued him, and he lost. He went all the way to the Supreme Court. He had to pay $50,000 to the artist, but in Paul's mind, it was all part of the business of what we were doing. So anyway, one of the speakers was Paul Resica, who was another giant of the New York art world, and another guy that I had learned a lot from. I had studied with him at the Skowhegan School. So anyway, he stood up and he told the most interesting story of Paul George's, when he first met Paul, And the story went that when Paul had come to New York from France, he wanted to study with Hans Hofmann, and he had applied to go to the Hofmann School up in Rhode Island, but he didn't get accepted. So he went to Rhode Island anyway, and he rented a place. And the first day of the Hoffman School, Hoffman has got his students in the room, and he's addressing the students, and he notices that there's somebody outside of the room on the front lawn of Hoffman's house with a big canvas, and he's painting on his front lawn. So Hoffman says, "Does anybody know who that is?" And everybody said, "No, we don't have any idea." So by chance, he picked Paul Resica. He said, "Paul, go out there and ask that guy who he is and what he's doing." So Paul Resica said, I went outside and I went up to Paul George's and I said, first of all, Mr. Hoffman wants to know who you are. And he said, "I'm Paul George's." And he said, "Mr. Hoffman wants to know what you're doing here." And so Paul said that George's said to him, "Is Mr. Hoffman blind?" And he said, "No, he's not blind. Of course he's not blind. Why do you ask such a silly question?" He said, "Well, you go back and you tell Mr. Hoffman I'm not going to tell him what I'm doing. If he can't figure it out, he can see what I'm doing." So he went back inside and he said, "Mr. Hoffman, his name is Paul George's, and he says, if you can't figure out what he's doing, then you must be blind." He said, "You go out and you tell that guy to come in here." So he said, I went outside and I said, "Mr. Hoffman wants to see you." So Paul Georges went back with him inside and walked up to Mr. Hoffman, and Hoffman said, "Do you want to paint?" And he said, "Of course I do. What do you think I'm doing outside?" He said, "Well, that's my property you're painting on." He said, "Did you see my painting?" He said, "I'm not painting your property. I'm painting across the road. That's not your property. I'm just standing on your property." He said, "Look, do you want to paint?" He said, "Get your stuff and join us. Come in and be with us." So with that, Paul went out, got his stuff, and that's how he got into the Hoffman class. So Paul Resica said, I was so impressed with this guy who had the courage to come up against this lion of the art world, Hans Hoffman, and be so aggressive. So he said, after the class, I asked him, I said, where do you live? So he gave me his address. So he said, later in the afternoon, I walked over to the address and I went up and knocked on the door, and a woman answered the door, and he said, "I'm looking for Paul George's." She says, "Well, he's not here." He said, No, he gave me this address." She says, "Oh, around back. There's a garage. He's there." So I walked around back, he said. I go over, there's the garage. So I knock on the door of the garage, and the door opens, and there's Paul George's. There's a cot on the floor, like one of those World War I army cots. Next to the cot, there's a record player, and there's one single classical record playing, and there on the cot, there's a book, James Joyce, Ulysses. There's nothing else in the room but canvases, and everywhere around the room there were canvases piled up against the wall. And I thought to myself, that matches so exactly that first visit that I made to Paul's studio all those years before. And so then, after hearing that story, the very next story was that Paul's daughter got up and told the story of Paul's last day. Anyway, Paul had gotten up in the morning, and he had a big canvas he was working on, and it was a really big canvas. It was 109 inches long and 96 inches tall, and he finished that canvas, and then to get it out of the barn that he was painting in, he had to take it off its stretcher so he could get it through the door, and he goes to another barn and then re-stretched it onto another canvas structure and goes into the house, gets a shower, and him and his wife drove down to the edge of the ocean where they had lunch, a late lunch in the afternoon. So they had a fresh fish, they had a glass of wine, they enjoying the air, and waitress comes over and says, "Would you like any dessert?" And with that, Paul turns to the waitress and he says, "No, I think I just need a siesta." And with that, his face fell on his plate and he had died. And I thought about that and I said, the artist was true in every way he could be, until his very last breath. And if there's a way to live, it's probably the way he lived. But if there's a way for an artist to die, that's the way an artist should die. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions or suggestions for future episodes, please reach out to Frank Hyder on Facebook or Instagram. We hope to see you at one of the next A Life in Art episodes.